Without further ado, we'll turn it over to our brother Dennis once again. His class this morning is entitled Writing on the Wall. Brother Dennis.
Good morning. Let's get this up and running. All right, we good? All right. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome back. Hopefully you had a good night's rest. And we spent a lot of time yesterday really focusing on Daniel and his close circle of friends. And the underlying theme really was the conversion of Nebuchadnezzar, as God had worked very diligently to get his attention. And in the end, he got it and made a declaration of his faith. Today, we move beyond Nebuchadnezzar to a new era. Having learned the lessons along with the king, we have another opportunity from another ruler to learn a new lesson. Now, chronologically, Daniel chapter 5 takes place after chapters 7 and 8. But they're nestled here primarily because it continues to tell us the story of Daniel. And it's in the midst of prophecy for sure. The latter chapters focus on the prophecy more than the life of the prophet. So those first 6 chapters are really telling us the story, and the second half are backfilling with more of the prophetic writings that were left for them. So let's start at verse 1. Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. So to get the timeline straight, we're talking about Nebuchadnezzar's grandson now. So considerable time has passed. His son, evil Merodach, came and went, and after a son-in-law, I'm gonna butcher this name for sure, Nerigal-Galeser, had a short reign, and another son, which is Labarosa-Laphod, he reigned even a shorter period. Along comes this new son-in-law now named Nabonidus, and during his reign is when the kingdom fell. But since he was out fighting battles, he would leave his son Belshazzar in charge while he was out there, therefore making him Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, the son of Nabonidus, being Belshazzar. So that a little more on the time of the family tree later, but that kind of sets the stage a little bit for the opportunity for the kingdom to learn, for the rulers to learn from the earlier stories that we saw dealing with Nebuchadnezzar. Now it's opportunity 2 generations later. The name means Bel protect the king, which is not a bad name for a guy you have in mind to take care of things while you're out in the field of battle. This was a drinking feast, which was common in religious ceremony. In this case, it was led in excess by the king. So not only is it a feast where their intention is to drink, the leader of this excess feast is none other than the ruler of the people. Now, verse 2, Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes and his wives and concubines might drink therein. So he was getting drunk now, and he made a very foolish and prideful decision. And it's interesting because that tends to happen when people drink too much. They start thinking very poorly and make very poor decisions. Nothing good happens when you're drunk. So the vessels came about 70 years earlier, and all of Israel knew of the 70-year prophecy, which we talked about a little bit yesterday. In fact, we mentioned this story takes place after chapters 7 and 8. What was the content of those chapters? Daniel's vision of the beasts and the ram and the he-goat. So it gives us a chance to see a reminder of what took place in chapter 2, which effectively means the kingdom of Babylon has to end and an inferior kingdom will take its place. The inferior power had been named. So there was no doubt who they should be on the lookout for. Plus, about 200 years before this, the actual ruler of this inferior power was named prophetically. Let's turn to Isaiah 44. Isaiah 44, verse 28, that saith of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple, thy foundation shall be laid. So here we're looking at a prophecy of Isaiah that's calling out Cyrus as the person who's going to establish the temple, allow the temple to be built and the foundation to be laid, which of course, that's going to come in the story of Ezra, Nehemiah, Joshua, the son of Josedek, and Zechariah. So that story is coming later, but before they can rebuild, they have to go back. So Daniel is about 90 years old right now, and he knew the time was about to happen. He knew the 70-year prophecy. He knew that time was up, and he knew that the Persians were the ones that would be labeled as the inferior power. He also knew that Cyrus was the guy, and he was already on the move. So people who had been watching and listening, they had been listening to scripture, could have been watching and waiting for the dramatic signs of their day to start unfolding. Now, all of us know that the return of Christ is near, and there is plenty of prophecy that we can get excited about. There's nothing left to happen that I can point to in scripture and say, Jesus can't return until X. Everything that we are told has to happen before he returns has already happened. So imagine if you and I woke up this morning and you read in the newspaper or saw on television news, or you got a blurb on your phone, or saw something on the internet. I don't care how you got your news, but somehow this morning you heard it announced that there was a new confederacy of nations in Europe and the Middle East, and they were being headed by Russia, who had united forces with the Eastern Greek Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church, and they targeted their first enemy, Israel. In fact, President Biden was quoted this morning saying, have they come to take a spoil? Have they come to take a prey? How would we all be acting right now if that was what we woke up to? All of a sudden, the focus of where we should be thinking, the focus on how close everything is, how it's happening, would get our attention, and it would be front and center in our minds. But if we hadn't been reading our scriptures, we hadn't paid attention to the prophecy, well, then none of that would have meant anything to us. So although the 70-year prophecy was well known, remember, the entire ecclesia that we saw in chapter 1 had surrendered to worshiping the gods of Babylon. So this small circle of 4, that circle may have grown just by influence and perhaps some preaching efforts, there is no doubt. But we have no reason to believe it was big. Now, that tells us how important it is to be ready for the signs of the times, and how exciting our lives can be if we see them ahead before them. That is where they were, and that's how we want to see it. Now, I know it's a little bit off our topic, but it's probably worth having a few words about Cyrus personally. Certainly, it should be worth our time. Here, he is called God's shepherd. In Isaiah 45, he is referred to as the anointed. Of course, the anointed is the naming of the Messiah. It's the same meaning as the word in the Greek that is Christ. So here we have Cyrus, who is a type of Jesus, that he is to be the shepherd and the anointed. And what is he going to do? He's going to rescue the people that are captive and send them to the promised land to build a temple to Almighty God and dwell with his people. That is a blow-by-blow description of what Jesus will do in the coming kingdom age. In fact, there's one more detail that history records, although the scripture does not. He was surrounded by a personal bodyguard. And this personal bodyguard's job, they had multiple layers. So there would be the outer layer, and then there would be another 2 or 3 inner layers, so that if in battle somebody were to get towards Cyrus, there would be a succession in his guard to protect him. This guard was called the Immortals. And the reason they were called immortal is because to the offending army, They never died. The first one fell, and there was one that stood in his place. And if that one fell, there was one that stood in his place. So their name were the immortals. Add that to the story. The shepherd anointed, surrounded by the immortals, rescuing the people to build a temple in the promised land. See the shadow? So when we look at this, this would have been absolutely exciting for people like Daniel, who had spent their whole life thinking about the time when God would deliver them and bring them back to the land. All right, so let's go back to task on this. Daniel 5, picking up at verse 3. Then they brought out the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. And the king, his princes, his wives, concubines drank in them. They drank wine, praised the gods of gold, silver, brass, iron, wood, and of stone. So here he displays contempt for Daniel and his God. It's probably the result of the prophecies he had probably heard about since he was a kid, and he's probably tired of hearing about them. This very feast concept had been prophesied about. The number of people, by a number of people. So this concept that they would be having a party when they would fall was not something that was hid in secret. A number of prophets had brought this up. So that would only add to the excitement to the people who were listening to the prophets of God. Now, we also want to note the religious setting here of drinking and praising gods. These gods had various values, not unlike the values of metal we saw in chapter 2, which are here represented again. But now we add wood and stone, which is a further connection back to Exodus and the law. But if we want to look forward as we keep connecting this Babylonian system from Genesis to Daniel to Revelation and tying it to Rome, really, this is not unlike the saint system, where there are patron saints in Catholicism for everything from travel to fertility. So having a god du jour, or a god for whatever it needs that ails you, is something common to the Babylonian influence, represented by the brass and the iron, pulling it forward into the influences of Rome. So we can see these things in Daniel's day, pointing very clearly to Jesus' day, culminating altogether to the last days. So verse 5, in the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw part of the hand that wrote. So we want to try to put a picture in our mind. This would be the hand of an angel. And he sees perhaps a hand and some fingers, but not necessarily an arm and a body. So that would get your attention nonetheless. And I know right now we're all in our homes and we're not necessarily at the hall, and there may not even be anybody next to you. But for a minute, imagine you're at your ecclesial hall one Sunday morning, and during the exhortation, you look over, and the kid next to you who was playing on a little iPad, all of a sudden his hands are down, and you see a little hand starting to draw on that iPad. Would that not get your attention? Now, odds are we're not at the hall drunk. So good news is it would get our attention sober. Imagine what it would do if we already had been impaired by the thinking of the world and the alcohol content that we had partaken of to excess. So as for the candlestick, think of it more of a chandelier than a menorah. Remember, he is drunk. So this would have been more frightening to him, and obviously a little bit entertaining to us if we were able to watch what would happen as this king saw this miracle that he could not explain, probably blamed on the wine. Now, here's a little nugget for you. What other story includes the fingers of God writing on stone? Our mind goes right back to the 10 Commandments. And what was the first one? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And we build on that with have no other gods before me. So this very writing on the wall should be a reflection back to faithful Israel, the remnant that remained, to God's first writing on stone to get their attention. The king's countenance has changed. He's gone from being happy and joyful and drinking, and his thoughts trouble him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed and his knees smote one against the other. So that's an outward reflection of an inward fear. We picture him with pride and arrogance. He says, bring out the vessels, lay out the wine. And now He's literally shaking because of fear. Doesn't look very regal if you can picture this in your story. Now, we read Isaiah 45, verse 1 earlier, but recall that it says, I will loose the loins of the kings. And that is exactly what happened 200 years later. Belshazzar is fulfilling prophecy right now. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the soothsayers, and he spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet, have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. So he says this aloud. This is not a somebody help. This is, hear ye, hear ye. He cries aloud. Anyone who can help, come on down. And don't you also get this feeling like, boy, he's getting to learn a lesson the same way that Nebuchadnezzar started in chapter 2? Somebody tell me what this means, and I'll give you the world. Well, he couldn't quite offer the world. He can say third ruler in the kingdom. Why? Because he was number 2. There was no higher office he could give. His father, the king, is out in the field. There's number 1. He, number 2, is minding the store. The best he could offer was number 3. So he offers the best position in his kingdom that he has. And he calls on the flesh surrounding him, just like Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2. So then comes all the king's wise men, but they couldn't read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. Well, why couldn't they read it? Verse 24 seems to indicate that the hand covered it, which I'm going to give you something to think about. If this was written in Hebrew, it would also make a little bit of sense, because Hebrew is written from right to left. So much like a left-handed person writing English, they're covering the words as they write. A right-handed person would do the exact same thing if we were writing in Hebrew. I wouldn't go nuts with that theory because it's a little weak, but it is possible that they couldn't read it because they didn't understand the Hebrew language. Although the hole in that theory is, why call your wise men? Why not call some of the Jews you had in your palace that were trained 70 years ago in the house of your grandfather? But covering it by the hand of the angel, that also is possible. I can't give you a definitive answer, but those are a couple things to think about. The real issue, again, is the wisdom of this world could offer nothing. That the hand of God was at work, and something very simple was made very complex because the wisdom of the world was completely useless in understanding the things of God. So the king was greatly troubled. His countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. Now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came in the banquet house. The queen spake, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor thy countenance be changed. So here's something very different. We just talked about chapter 2 and how this sounds very much like what Nebuchadnezzar went through. So fear trickles down while the Persians are ready to attack. The king is drunk and he's confused, and he's going to get one shade paler now. Verse 10 has the queen mother, who's Nitocris. I'm not pretending to be a Babylonian language expert, which is Nebuchadnezzar's daughter and Belshazzar's mom. So this is not his wife going, hey, honey, we need to talk. This is his mother, who would have heard her father talk about chapter 2 and the conversion her father went through that changed his life in chapter 4. His mother comes in and she says, hey, don't worry about it. I've seen this before. His wives and concubines are already there. Remember from verse 3. She would have been able to recall firsthand some of the things that Nebuchadnezzar experienced. She would have known firsthand the wisdom of Daniel as she talked to his father. She would have had secondhand experience from the stories that her father must have told about the life-changing things he witnessed at the hand of the God of Israel. And so she starts with the greeting common in the time in Babylon: live forever. Words that haunt, as those were the thoughts that came in, going right back to chapter 2. And so what does she say? She comes in and says, all right, there's a man in your kingdom who the Spirit who in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of thy father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, the king, I say thy father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. So she continues. She's going to lay out the case for him to understand. Now, it appears that at this point, Daniel has been demoted in some way or removed from immediate direct contact with the king. And there's a lot of reasons that could have happened. Perhaps it was his advanced age. He's coming up on 90. It could be due to the sharp decline in power and the morality found in the kingdom after the death of Nebuchadnezzar. The kingdom at its peak was when Nebuchadnezzar was king, and it eroded fairly quick. Remember, 43 of the 70 years where Babylon was a superpower were while Nebuchadnezzar was in control. Her description of him tells us that she shared the respect and understanding that her father once displayed. She's explaining to him as a man that knows what he's talking about, and your father, or literally grandfather, promoted. Now, it's interesting some of the words she uses to describe him, because you can see she's talking to him in polytheistic terms. Let's keep going at verse 12. For as much as an excellent spirit in knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams, remember he's got that under his belt, showing of hard sentences, dissolving of doubts, were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. So she had, in verse 11, we have her talking in terms he would understand, as he makes reference to him in polytheistic ways. But in verse 12, it gets very specific, and she calls him Daniel. And she notes him as Daniel. And she says, let Daniel be called, which tells us Daniel's reputation, which we've already saw was great in the ecclesia, was known internationally, and even now in the kingdom at his advanced age, he is known as Daniel. Now she says, the king named him Belteshazzar, but even after she reminds him of that, now let Daniel be called. So she provides 6 qualities that should give him some reason why you should talk to this Daniel guy. The number of flesh. And in verse 11, she adds the spirit of the holy gods, if you will. So now you have a complete 7. So she is appealing to his flesh, but realistically, Daniel has the key to understanding what God is trying to tell them. Something interesting is where it says the dissolving of doubts. According to the margin in the Oxford Bible, this is the dissolving of knots. Now, that's not a bad quality for a person who's a problem solver and good at puzzles, that he can come in and dissolve the knot and make it straight. Notice that she also, too, in using his Hebrew name, is adding some unqualified confidence in him. So though the kingdom had strayed from the words of Daniel and the God of Daniel, she is still holding him in a higher regard. And after all that, imagine your mother talking to you like that, where she comes in and says, let me set you straight. But the good news is he listens. Why? Well, he's afraid, and she's got a little bit of influence, so he doesn't have any other ideas. All his wise guys can't help. His wives and concubines and wise men are useless. So mom says there's one guy that can help. Okay, let's talk to that guy. So Daniel's brought in before the king, and the king spoke and said unto Daniel, art thou Daniel, note Hebrew name, which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? I have heard of thee, and that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. So further evidence of a demotion. Well, I've heard about you. Well, she just heard about him one verse ago. So you've got a little bit of a reputation. I've heard a little bit about you. But if he was still holding a prominent role in the kingdom, he would know very well he'd be his closest counselor. Verse 14, he's really just rehearsing what his mother just said. Now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known unto me the interpretation thereof. but they could not show the interpretation of the thing. And you can almost have this feeling of Daniel. Can you picture him going, here we go again? It's not a new drill for him. I have heard of thee that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve knots, that thou canst read the writing and make known unto me the interpretation thereof. Thou shalt be clothed with scarlet, have a gold chain about thy neck, and shall be called the third ruler in the kingdom. Same basic offer he got in chapter 2. That's not Daniel's motive anyways. He didn't care about it when he was a young man. Why would he care about it now? So Daniel answered very similarly, and he says, before the king, let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king, and make known unto him the interpretation. Think about what he just said. Daniel was humble. He knew Babylon was coming to an end. He was actually excited to see the hand of God at work. And that one more time, Daniel is given an opportunity to be a key player in the unfolding of God's plan that he has been told would happen. Now, these gifts that he's offering are completely irrelevant. I mean, imagine Daniel knows the 70 years is up. Cyrus is on his way. Persians are coming. Everybody, he's on high alert. And everybody who's been watching the prophetic work that God has been delivering, specifically through prophets, including Daniel, they know what's happening. What good would it be to have a bunch of gold and a new robe and some jewelry and to be a third leader in a kingdom that's about to end? So his defiance is characteristic of his courage and faith. He tells him, give your stuff to someone else. Go give it to somebody. You can almost say, using today's language, give your stuff to somebody who cares. But I'm going to read it for you anyways. I'll tell you what, I'll give you the language for free. The margin says a fee. So that he was offering to give him a fee. That's what the word rewards is, which kind of puts you to a paid clergy, does it not? You want to pay me to tell you what the God says? Nah, give your gifts to someone else. I'll let you know what God's saying at no charge. The words of truth are priceless. And so here he goes. O thou king, the most high God. Notice the phrase. That phrase he used throughout his time with Nebuchadnezzar, the phrase that Nebuchadnezzar used in his confession of faith. The Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. And that was chapter 4. God did it all along. Nebuchadnezzar eventually learned that the only reason he had anything, including his sanity, was the hand of God. And for the majesty that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would he slew, and whom he would he kept alive, and whom he would he set up, and whom he would he put down. So this is repeated throughout the book. We've already addressed it. We'll keep going. But when his heart was lifted up, when he got proud, and his mind was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. So he goes from the glory of Nebuchadnezzar that the Most High gave him, and he had power to do whatever he thought to all people, nations, languages, and tongues. But he boldly, yet humbly, delivers the truth to Belshazzar, much as he did to Nebuchadnezzar. When he went in before Nebuchadnezzar and said, you are the tree, he didn't water down the truth to make it more palatable. He said it clearly. You are the tree. This is talking about you, and it's a reward to your enemies, to those that hate you. But he did it with empathy and compassion because he had built a relationship with Nebuchadnezzar. Now, when we look at this, we don't have that relationship now. So he still humbly, but directly and boldly recounts this story and makes sure Belshazzar knows this is not a new way for the Most High to treat the king of Babylon. When he was proud and his heart was lifted up, he was removed from the throne and his glory was taken from him. In pride, we can see the arrogance of man. and it makes the fall harder than necessary. Just as it was with Nebuchadnezzar, so will it be with Belshazzar. And we can all relate to that to some degree. When we stop and think that we have done something, it is amazing how hard it is for us to acknowledge that we really are nothing, and that we have problems in this life because it gets us focused on the fact that on our own we are pretty useless. The only thing that makes us of any value to our God is our willingness to change. It's not who we are, it's who we could be. And that's what makes us of a value. So this concept of pride and arrogance in the king is something that we should be able to relate to. Hopefully we get it a lot sooner than the time when a judge, the judge of Al, which is what Daniel's name is, God is judge, when the judge stands before us to humble us. He reminds him of the story, which perhaps he had heard. Maybe he never took it seriously. We don't really know. But he tells him he was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like beasts. His dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and he appointed it over it whomsoever he will. He repeats a fact. It's a known fact to show evidence that the future fulfillment was exactly in line both with what was previously interpreted as well as the current events that he's talking about right now. Nebuchadnezzar had already learned this lesson, chapter 4. Belshazzar could have learned this lesson if he chose to. This is the practical difference between knowledge and wisdom. The difference between knowledge and wisdom practically is really how you learn your lesson. You obtain knowledge if you run into a wall and it hurts and you say, boy, I'm not running into that wall anymore. That caused me pain. That is knowledge. And we all learn sometimes by doing something dumb or painful and going, I'm not doing that again. But wisdom is seeing somebody else run into a wall and going, boy, I'll bet that hurt, and learning from somebody else's experience. Because if the only way you and I learn is by doing dumb things and hurting ourselves, boy, we go through life with a lot of bumps and bruises. But if we can learn lessons by the failures and successes of others, it allows us to take things in Scripture, things around us, lessons from history, lessons from God, lessons from our family. If we can learn lessons by the things that happen to others, we don't necessarily have to experience ourselves. And that's the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Belshazzar had access to the truth that was being delivered to him by his mother and by Daniel, but he chose to disregard it. The only way he was going to learn any of this was to run into the wall himself. Unfortunately for him, it was too late. This, and thou his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thy heart, though thou knewest all this. So how much he knew, we're not sure. But that he understood the story, that he understood what the Most High had done with his grandfather, he knew enough of it to be held responsible. And what makes us responsible? Knowledge and understanding. You knew these lessons, but you did not humble your heart as your grandfather did. He chose not to. This shows that he chose to disregard it. It's not that he was ignorant of the power of the God that has changed his grandfather's life. He chose to disregard it and lean to his own understanding. Sadly, the natural course of human nature. Daniel continues, you have lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before thee, for thou, thy lords, thy wives, thy concubines have drunk wine in them. Thou hast praised the gods of silver, gold, brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know. And the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. So it's a recall to the beginning of this chapter. All the things that were important to you, to worship, to defile, to discredit, all the gods that have no value, you have elevated, and you have disregarded the only God that has any control. His hand was at work in your grandfather's life. His hand is at work throughout the planet. His hand is at work in raising and removing kings, in rising and destroying kingdoms. His hand is even holding your very breath. But yet you chose not to glorify the only God that mattered. Imagine being Daniel talking like that to the king. He picks out 4 specific things to get his attention. You've lifted up yourself against the Lord. You've brought vessels of his house before you. You've drunk wine in them. You've defiled them. And now you've praised other gods, not Yahweh, not the only God that mattered. Those are the 4 charges brought before him. So then was part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the writing. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. Numbered, weighed, and divided. Now, what does that mean? Let's continue. This is the interpretation of the thing. And notice there's not a lot of pomp and circumstance and not a lot of softening the blow here. Daniel's being direct, and he's saying it very clearly. Here's what it says. Numbered, weighed, and divided. Here's what it means. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. This was doubled, which we've already talked about that. Whenever it's doubled, that's a point of emphasis. Numbered means this is happening now. It would take place that very night, as we're going to see in verse 30. Time was up, and it was urgent. You have been numbered, and your kingdom will be finished. Actually, the number was 70, and the time had expired. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and found wanting. So like Israel in Christ's day, they had doctored the scales. He could not blame anyone else. There was no one else to blame for his choosing other gods, though he knew of the Most High God that had established this kingdom. He is before a man named God is judge, and he is being judged and found wanting. Likewise, we cannot stand before our judge and blame our parents or blame our family. We can't blame our ecclesia, the circumstances, the world around us, our opportunities, how we fared in trials, problems we might have had, things we wish we had. None of that is going to matter when the representative of God's judgment stands before us and reads the writing. If we are found wanting, it is our fault, because like Belshazzar, we know better. The measure we meet to others is the measure used against us. And so here is the beautiful thing to us as Bible students, is if we read these words and it makes us go, boy, I feel like I'm out of balance. I may be wanting myself in a measure if I were standing before my Lord today. We're still breathing. And unlike Belshazzar, the time is not up for us. We can still change, refocus, and get our life back on track. That this warning came to Belshazzar when it was too late was because Belshazzar ignored the other warnings. Perez, the kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians, named again. Now, why does it say Perez and not upharsin? Well, it's actually the same word in Aramaic. It's the same Strong's number. So the translators said upharsin in the other verse and Perez in this verse. It should say the same thing in both. It's only used 3 times in the Bible. Granted, Aramaic is only used in a few places in the Bible. But the 3 times it's used, it's translated different ways. The 3, upharsin from a couple verses ago, Perez in this verse, and it's also the word divided in this verse. So divided is what's being read. Now, he spells it out very clearly, does he not? He doesn't just say you're numbered, weighed, found wanting, and you're going to be divided. He tells them by whom the division is coming. A reinforcement of Daniel chapter 2, a reinforcement of Daniel chapter 7, a reinforcement of Daniel chapter 8, and a reinforcement of the 70-year prophecy we keep talking about. He spells it out clearly. The only thing left to name was Cyrus, and that had already been done by Isaiah. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet, put a chain of gold about his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. Although Daniel rejected these things earlier in verse 17, he's been given the title of third ruler, which in effect means he is left in charge. If the interpretation Daniel just gave is accurate, and the king is going to lose his kingdom, this would have made Daniel the ruler of the kingdom. That's effectively what happens by this charge. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine Daniel here at the end of his life, living out the long-lived prophecy that he has been personally allowed to proclaim before the nation of Israel, the kingdom of Babylon, and personal contact with rulers of the known world? And here God is setting before him an opportunity that he probably didn't imagine, to be the single piece by which the transfer of power takes place between Babylon and Persia. Verse 30, in that night was Belshazzar the king of the Chaldeans slain. That night. Jeremiah 51 and other prophecies already mentioned were at last fulfilled. Cyrus defeated the Babylonians by having the Persians divert the Euphrates for his troops to enter the city during what appears to be an annual feast, not unlike the feast that we just talked about. Now, there's a number of stories we can tell, and we've got a couple minutes. I'm going to tell one of my favorites, and that is how God is in complete control, and he sets before the kingdom of men things that would confound conventional wisdom, but would bring about his glory. Do you know that the primary reason that the Persians defeated the Babylons was the genius of Cyrus? Most of us concede that. Do you know that there was a plot to ambush and have him and his immortal army slaughtered in Syria before they could do what we just read? And do you know it was foiled by baggage camels? Hear this out. Cyrus is on the move, and this is not, when you're moving a big army, it's not very difficult to see the movement of that army. You don't need satellite footage to see tens of thousands of armed soldiers going through the villages you are the leader of to get word that there's something happening. And so Cyrus and his army are on the move, and they're going to go through a valley in Syria that would give them the opportunity to go in and divert the Euphrates and eventually overcome the central point of Babylon and make what would eventually be the fall of the Babylonian Empire. So as they're going through Syria, they are aware that going through this valley is a prime place for an ambush. So what do they do about it? Well, Cyrus is talking to his military advisors, and one of them says, you know, we probably should put the baggage camels in front so that if for some reason they really are ready to ambush, when they come down, we'll lose all our stuff, but all of the army can back out the back of the valley as opposed to being cut off, and the only thing that can escape is our stuff on the camels. That made sense to Cyrus. He said, a good idea. And that is exactly what they did. Well, they start their march, baggage camels in front. And lo and behold, the Babylonians were ready and had on both sides of the hill an army on horseback that was going to go down into the valley and ambush the army led by Cyrus, which would have killed Cyrus and ended Bible prophecy and the change of power that God had said would happen. But what took place? Something different, something not intended by the suggestion, but something very interesting to our God being his hand at work in this. The smell of the baggage camels was so foreign and foul to the horses that the horses threw their riders in the valley. And what should have been a rout of of mounted riders slaughtering an army turned into hand-to-hand combat, and the Persians won. Thanks to the smell of baggage camels, God's plan continued, moving forward as he said it would. There are stories like that throughout history, and when we see those things, it's just a reminder that not everything that God's doing with his hand has to be lightning and thunder. Sometimes it's just the subtle decision to put a smelly baggage camel in front. And God uses that to confound the conventional wisdom of the world. Let's go to verse 31. Verse 31 has Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Now, Darius is a title. It's not a name. It means Lord. It's much like the titles you would have heard throughout Scripture of Herod in Jesus' day, or Caesar in Jesus' day, or even Pharaoh in Moses' day. Darius means Lord. So the Lord of the Medes, we have the Medes and Persians combining to be that inferior kingdom that takes the head of gold off the scene. So we have the Lord of the Medes taking the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Now, when this story ends, remember, we're reading these first 6 chapters as we're looking at the life of Daniel and how his influence on other kings. Imagine as a setup to what we're going to look at in Daniel 6 for our exhortation. Imagine this Mede coming in, introducing himself and asking, who's in charge here? And can you imagine Daniel now saying something to this effect? Well, until you came in, I was. Let me tell you a little bit about my God.